Starting the next episode in this video series, we are looking at the cylinder for the engine we're working on. It has been returned from the machine shop. Unfortunately, it has been returned from the machine shop because the machine shop has decided that they're unable to do the boring and finishing of this cylinder. So I have already spoken to a machine shop who does cylinder boring as one of their major lines of work. The machine shop that rejected this or decided they couldn't do the cylinder was not an engine machine shop. They were a machine shop that did cylinder boring because they had the equipment there to do cylinder boring in most cases. Unfortunately, they felt their equipment was not capable to do this cylinder because of its composition. It's cast iron. It is slightly longer than most modern cylinders, and with the ports in it, they were afraid the tool might chatter, and they actually were afraid they might damage the cylinder. So better to be on the safe side and not ask them to go ahead and do it. So the second machine shop is confident they can do it, so they're going to get a try. With this cylinder, I'm going to take the oversized piston. I have a 15 thou oversized piston. It's marked here. The rings are off of it. The machine shop doesn't need the piston rings. They need to measure the size of the piston, and then they need the specs out of the manual for the engine so they can determine what size the finished bore of the cylinder should be. So just to compare here, I have a couple of other pistons. Here is it says standard on it. I don't know if you can see it. There's a little bit of corrosion on here. So that's a standard. So that's a standard bore piston. It does fit. There's a little bit of clearance there, as there should be. So that's a standard bore piston. I actually have a 10 thou oversized piston here. That does not fit, and because of the amount of scoring in this cylinder, I think it's pretty deep. We're hoping that boring it for this 15 thou oversized piston will take this down to a clean surface, and when it's honed, it'll look just like new. So with the new piston rings on, this will have the compression of a new engine. So that's that cylinder, and while I'm going to the machine shop, I'm going to take this other cylinder I have for another engine I'm working on. Actually, it came with a machine. I'm not sure what engine it was used on because it has never been on an engine in the time I've had it. This cylinder I don't think is scored as badly as this cylinder. So what I have for it, this is the one that's going to get the 10 thou over piston. Again, it looks like it is presently a standard bore. And the 10 thou oversized piston doesn't fit it, so this will get bored for a 10 thou oversized piston, this one for a 15 thou oversized piston. When they come back from the machine shop, I'll have to do some finish work on the ports, take the sharp edges off them, wash them, maybe paint this one, who knows. And hopefully we'll be able to continue from there with installing pistons and cylinders. But we'll go see the machine shop and see what they can do. Well, here we have the cylinders once again. Once again, they are back from the machine shop, but this time they have been machined. Now they are dirty yet. They were machined and oiled, and they've got a little bit of dirt on them still. I will have to wash them in soapy water before I assemble these to the engine. They'll have to be washed in soapy water and re-oiled. Now, one thing the machine shop did for me was the ports, the transfer ports on each side. I don't know if you can see them here. and the intake, that's the exhaust port actually, and the intake port here. When the cylinder is machined, that creates sharp edges here. So the machine shop has actually gone ahead and removed the sharp edge from the ports. So those don't require any more work, but what I do have to do is check and see how the piston rings fit. Now, of course, this was the cylinder that was going to be machined for the 15 thou over piston. If I try the 10 thou over piston in it here, of course it fits with lots of clearance, and this one was machined for the 10 thou over, so I'll try the 15 in it. It does not fit. So if we try the 15 thou piston in this cylinder, this is the cylinder for the engine we're working on. That has a slight bit of play in it, which it should. According to the manual, the page I am reading from here, it says piston skirt clearance in bore minimum 4.7 thousandths of an inch, so it's 0.0047 of an inch. So I was assured that these were bored and finished to allow 5 thou clearance, so they're just over the minimum clearance, which is good. And this again is the 10 thou over piston. In the other cylinder there's a little bit of dirt in there. There is a little bit of play in there, as there should. There should be about 5 thou of play, which is only 2.5 thou on each side of the piston, so that's pretty tight. The cylinders are bored and honed, ready to go. Before we can assemble them, we do have to check what the piston ring gap is when the rings are in the cylinder. So according to our handy Villiers manual, this is just a page I photocopied out of it. Ring clearance in groove, that's not what we want. That's the ring clearance in between the ring and the groove and the piston. That should be fine because we're working with new pistons and rings. Maximum permissible gap, that's, we want to be between that measurement, actually for the 9E, which is 30 thou, and it says end gap in bore in inches 8 to 12. So we want 8 to 12. If it's beyond 12, the maximum we want before we would reject the cylinder or rings would be 30 thou, but we want between 8 and 12. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to carefully install a piston ring just in the cylinder, gently here. Now I am working with two different pistons here, and they're two different makes of pistons and two different styles of rings. This piston, there is a peg or a pin in the ring groove so that the ring can't rotate around the piston. You don't want the ring rotating around the piston, because if an end of the piston was allowed to go, if the end of the piston ring was allowed to go through a port, the ends could come out and get caught in the port, and they break off, damage the piston, the cylinder, etc. So, but these two pistons have different style pegs. This peg or pin is the full size of the groove, so the end of the piston ring is actually flat when viewed at from the side, and there is a little cutout for the peg if viewed from above or below. Whereas this piston, the pin is only halfway in the groove, so these piston rings have a step in them the other way. So if you look at them from the side, they're not square, but they are square this way. So that determines which way around that ring goes. So that ring would have to go that way if it goes in the bottom groove, and also in the top groove. It's the same way. So that's cylinders that we're not working with at the moment. So I'm going to just use this piston to push the piston ring we're checking partway in down the cylinder, and we're going to take my 8 thou, I think we said, 8 thou feeler gauge. There's a 10, there's a 26. Oh, jumped a little bit there. I'll use a brass 8. Doesn't matter if it's brass or steel we're using. And the end of the piston ring is right there. We want to make sure that feeler gauge goes through it. It does. It doesn't drag. I'm not pulling the piston ring out of place when I do that. And just to see if I can find my 12 thou here. So we want between 8 and 12. The gap allows the piston ring to expand and not bind in the cylinder. And let's see. That is going through there. It's actually a little, that's the 12 thou gauge, and it is not hanging up in there. So it's over 12. Well, it's supposed to be maximum 30. Let's go to 20. And the 20 does not fit. So we're between 12 and 20. So we're definitely above the minimum gap. We're above the maximum gap for what they would say is new, I guess, but we're below the maximum permissible gap. So just check this in a few spots. Push it down a little further. And the gap is as much of an issue, or can be an issue, with the size of the cylinder as the size of the ring. So we'll just make sure we have at least 8. I just pushed it down. It's above the intake port, below the exhaust port. Still checking above. I think wider than the 8 thou. There's a 14 thou. Check it. Again, it's over 14. Push it in some more. That's actually more where the ring would travel. The ring is not likely to get this low in the cylinder. Now, I'll just turn the cylinder over. I'll just check it with the 14 here. We're still greater than 14. Try it with the 18 again. So it's not 18 thou, so it's nowhere near the maximum permissible of 30. Put the ring near the top. Check it again with the, we'll just go straight to the 12. 12. It's definitely at least 12, and that is getting near the top of where the ring would travel I would say that's about the highest the ring would go when it's on the piston. So there we have at least the minimum 8. I would say we have it more likely more than 12. Now I'll just do this again with the other ring. Start at the bottom here because the bore of the cylinder is tapered, and try to put the end of the ring so that when I push it, it doesn't go through any of the ports. And I'm just going to make sure it's at least 12 all the way down. And this one is a little, that one won't let the 12 go through, so we'll try the 8. So you can see, and actually so I can see a little better here. It's definitely 8. It's more than 8. Try the 10. Again, this is not where we're likely to see the piston ring. The piston would have to be close to this location in order for the piston ring to actually be there. But I'm confident in the work of the machine shop. I'm sure they made the cylinder cylindrical, not tapered. And again, we'll just go to our 12. I don't have the tools to actually measure the bore. So 12 thou again. And it does go through. A little further. Again, the gauge is going through the gap. Bring this over. Yes, at least 12. And up to about where it would be at the maximum piston travel. Make sure it's at least 12. And it is. So those piston rings are, the gap is fine. Now if I needed to file them, if the gap was too small, I've read where the suggested method of filing them is to get a thin flat file, clamp it in a vise, and carefully file holding the ring. The rings are very delicate, even though they're springy, they can break very easy. So they should be handled carefully. So I can wash this cylinder and then lightly oil it again. With some, I'll probably just use some 30 weight motor oil as an assembly lube, so it doesn't start, so the engine doesn't start with the cylinder and rings dry. The rings will have to be installed on the piston, sorry. The rings have to be installed on the piston. Now, these rings are two different colors. One is like a chrome finish and the other is black, so I'll have to do some research. See if one of those should be the top and one the bottom. And we'll just go ahead and check the rings on this other cylinder to make sure these are at least 8 thou. I'll just go ahead and just check with the 12 thou. Yes, 12 thou. 12 thou. I'm not overly concerned that the gap is larger than the minimum recommended 8. A larger gap means there may be a slight loss of compression past the gaps of the ring, but I'm not worried about losing that little bit of compression due to a slightly larger gap in the rings. I would rather see that gap oversized so I know that the rings are not going to bind and possibly cause seizure of the engine. So that's showing at least 12 thou all the way up. I'll do that with the other ring. Putting the gap so it'll the gap in the ring, so as I push it from bottom to top, the ends don't go through a port. 12. 12 fits. Now, one thing with this cylinder, this is a cylinder that was not on an engine when I got it. It came with a machine I bought. I don't know what the piston looked like that was in it because there wasn't one. And I did have it bored for a 10 thou over piston. That ring checks out fine the whole way. When I got it back from the machine shop, he asked me about this slight mark here. You see there's still a slight scratch that didn't come out of it because he only bored it for 10 thou over, which is only taking 5 thou off of both sides to get the 10, so there's still a little mark. I don't even think I can feel it with my fingernail. I'm not worried about that. The other cylinder taking 15 thou off of it, which is 7.5 thou here and here, cleaned up nicely. So I think just as a rule of thumb for myself, if I have a standard bore cylinder, I'm just going to get it done 15 thou over. So if I wanted to clean this up, I'd have to get a 15 thou over piston, take it back to the machine shop, and get it machined, bored, and honed to fit the 15 thou piston. It's now ready for the 10 thou over piston, and that little mark there right at the top of the bore is not something I'm going to worry about. So I'll just do some research and see which way these rings should go, and then we'll be once the cylinder's washed and oiled, we'll be able to put the engine a little more together. A brief consultation of the engine manual hasn't given me any information on which way up these rings should go, whether the black one should go at the bottom or the top. They simply state when you're tearing the engine down to make note of which way the rings are so you put them back in the same place. They don't discuss a replacement piston. But I do have a replacement piston here, and the rings on it are black on the bottom and chrome finish on the top. So I'm going to put the rings on our new piston that way for now, and I'm just going to take some compressed air and blow out the ring grooves. So I've actually taken some solvent and compressed air and cleaned the piston grooves out, and I'm just going to take some solvent and clean the piston rings off carefully. I think there is some preservative on them. I think it's been there since goodness knows when. Careful not to catch the cloth on the end of the ring and breaking it. Okay, that ring looks clean, and I said the black one was going on the bottom. So we need to find out where the peg is, the pin, and carefully with our fingers spread the ring out. Oh, there, it's in the top groove. We want it in the bottom groove. There, so the ring is, of course, it's a loose fit on the piston. It will compress when it goes into the cylinder. There's our other pin or peg. So this ring goes on this way. Always a little bit tense putting piston rings on. I'm afraid I'm going to break them, because they're easily broken if you spread them too far. So there. Rings are on the piston. Now I'll put lots of oil on the piston, particularly where the rings are in their grooves, so they're well lubricated when this goes together. But the next step is clean the cylinder and get the engine out here. I'll put the piston on the connecting rod and go from there. I went ahead and wiped the piston with a clean rag and some solvent to take any dirt I may have picked up on it from the cylinder when I was using the piston to move the ring through the cylinder. And I've taken the cylinder and dunked it in a bucket of hot soapy water and swished it around. The idea, of course, or the idea here, I guess, is to take any filings that are left from the machining process and make sure there are none of those left in the cylinder or in any of the ports. So I'm just going to blow this dry with some compressed air, wipe it good with a clean cloth, and then I'm going to put some oil on these surfaces and definitely in the bore itself. So with some motor oil on a clean rag, I'm just going to wipe the bare surfaces here to stop this from rusting while it sits. It's not going to sit for long before I put it back together. But even overnight, freshly machined iron surfaces could rust, so I don't want that. We'll just make sure everything's well coated here. The entire bore is coated with oil, and the gasket surface top and bottom. A little in the holes for the stud and the bolts for the cylinder head. A little down the. That's a decompressor passage. It's not used on in our application. It just goes down through to the exhaust port. When it's installed, it just allows you to bleed off a little bit of the compression to make the engine easier to start, being a single cylinder. And we got some oil in the exhaust port here, on the threads where the exhaust nut goes, and on the intake flange here. Yeah, there's lots of oil here. And that's ready for the next step. Now that the piston ring end gaps have been checked and the rings are installed on the piston, I'm ready to install the piston on the connecting rod and then install the cylinder. First, I want to remove the outer fan housing because this part interferes with installing the nuts on the left side of the cylinder. So I had set this on because I wasn't sure how long it was going to be before I was actually able to install the piston and cylinder. So now we'll take the fan off. A simple tap, maybe. I did this before and didn't have something on the crankshaft here to catch the fan. The two nuts, well, one nut is off, the other nut I've just slightly threaded on the shaft here. Now if I can just convince the fan to come back off. There we go. I didn't lose it on the floor that time. Now, I've got to be careful I don't lose the stuff I'm going to need to put this together. So I'll take the fan, the two nuts and the washer, and set them out of harm's way. Then if I have the right wrench, and I don't, one nut will remove this housing. Is that the right wrench? Yes, it is. Okay. So there's just one nut holding this cover on. I haven't put any oil in the chain case yet. I believe the gasket's going to come off with the cover. Yes. Yes, the gasket is still there. Set this out of the way. So now we have full access to the nuts on both sides of the cylinder base here. I'll just go ahead and remove all of the nuts. And some of you may remember that when I took the cylinder off and went to put these nuts on the studs for safekeeping, the threads on one of the studs were slightly damaged. So I purchased a correct die and simply threaded the die on by hand over the stud that had the damaged threads, and I only needed to do it by hand. I didn't need to add pliers or anything to help me turn the die. So I was able to repair the threads without having to replace the stud, and as you can see, I just grabbed one of the nuts and they all of the studs, the threads are in good condition here now. We wouldn't want to discover that we had a damaged thread when we had everything set together. That would not be the time to find a damaged thread. I have to just double check that one. I just took the nuts off of there. I knew they were fine. I'll just showing you. Okay, so that's done. Now, I'm going to put the piston on the connecting rod. Just want to make sure, okay, the gasket will fit over the piston. So what I want to do is put the piston on the connecting rod, then put some sealer on the gasket, set the gasket on here. I'm going to put the sealer on the side of the gasket that goes in the crankcases. I'm just going to put a little smear of Motor Seal Power Sport Gasket Maker. Just a light smear, because there are splits in the cases here where the cases join, and just in case there are any minor imperfections in the case, I want the sealer down, and then the cylinder will go on top. The cylinder is cast iron. It should be, and it's all one piece. It should be nice and flat and smooth. And to install the piston on the connecting rod, we need to take the wrist pin partially out of the piston, and we need to note that the piston is marked front. Front being the exhaust port side, the exhaust on the cylinder. And that is important because the gaps in the rings, of course, will have to line up with the pins, and those pins should line up with areas in the cylinder that do not have ports. We do not want those rings going through a port, because the end can catch on a port and break. Now I have a punch here, and this should just push out, but that is a very snug fit, so I've got the heat gun here. Just going to add some heat. So I've got the heat gun ready here. I'm just going to get some of this extra stuff out of the way. Just want to add some heat. Now the manual actually says to use a soldering iron on the dome of the piston. So I'm just going to try adding some heat to the dome, the top of the piston. I should probably have some gloves handy, but I don't. See if that was enough. And I'm going to push that out towards the, there we go, there. The pin is moving. That didn't take much warming. And I think that, is that quite far enough? No. So it looks like it's got to be out. We go all the way out of the bushing on that side there. Now, that could have also been stuck because of the preservative on it that's been on there for years. Okay, so that is far enough over. So I need to get some oil. I want to make sure I put some oil on all of these parts I'm assembling here, so that when the engine first starts, everything's well lubricated. And what I'm going to use as a assembly lube, I guess, is some of the two-stroke oil I usually mix with the fuel when I'm running these engines. So I'll just give you a look down in the cases here. Oh, straps in the way. So in here there are a couple of ports. Those, I believe, are to let oil that doesn't get burned drain down and lubricate the bearing. So I'm going to put a couple of drops of oil down each one of those holes, and you can see a cutout in the big end of the connecting rod. I'm going to dribble some oil on there, and then I'm going to move this way and dribble some oil on it, sorry, this way. Make sure there's some oil down each side of the connecting rod. Make sure there's some oil down each side of the crankshaft between the weights and the cases here. I'll put a little oil in this hole for the wrist pin, and then I think we'll be ready to put the piston on. I will be able to get the elastic band out when all is done here, so do a little bit in there, a little bit in there, and that's some of that's going down between the cases and the crankshaft. And just move our elastic band out of the way here. A little oil on the big end of the connecting rod. There are bearings in there, but they should be lubricated, and there's this oil will eventually, most of it I'm sure, will be burnt. It will mix with the fuel and end up in the cylinder. Just make sure that oil is spread around a bit. So we'll just make sure that oil gets spread around. And I'll put some in the wrist pin bushing here. I'm going to make it a little bit of a mess here. So now that everything's lubed a bit here, and we'll lube the piston and the piston rings before we put the cylinder on. So now I'm just going to see if this wrist pin's going to go back in. I did lube that. I can't lube the wrist pin because I'm going to have to push it through. Pushing it through may help. Well, it's going to go with a little bit of hand pressure here. It would help if I could see here. Of course, I should just look through and see if we're lined up or not. Just use my punch here to see if I can line things up. Just carefully set that back while I shine some light on it here. Very close. There we go. The wrist pin is started in the connecting rod. Okay, so all that lube helped. So the wrist pin goes in. There are a set of grooves in the piston here. The wrist pin has to go in far enough that the two circlips provided with the piston can go in. Oops, there, I pushed it too far. Looks about right. And we have something to hold that piston here. 2 clean blocks of wood. There, that will hold the piston up and prevent it from hitting the top of the cases and damaging itself and the cases. So I'm ready to install the circlips or snap rings into the piston, except I haven't got my snap ring pliers assembled yet, so I'll just share some important information about snap rings. A snap ring is not a snap ring. Like, all snap rings are not the same, I guess is what I'm trying to say. These are the snap rings or circlips that were supplied with this piston, so I'm using them. And it's important to use the correct style of snap ring. I own a 2-stroke motorcycle, Japanese made 2-stroke motorcycle, that somebody had replaced the circlips, the snap rings, in the wrist pins that retain the wrist pins with the wrong style. They replaced them actually with this style. But the grooves in the piston were made for a wire type. These are flat, so they're on 3 sides they're square. There's 2 flat sides and a flat surface here, so it's square. Whereas the clips that belonged in the pistons on my motorcycle were round. And the way I discovered that someone had used the wrong circlips was when I was installing some exhaust gaskets. I noticed something sticking out of the crown of the piston, and since it looked wrong that there was something sticking out of the crown of the piston, I removed the cylinder head and found a piece of a circlip stuck in the crown of the piston. And when I removed the cylinder to see where the snap ring came from, there was a gouge in the piston from the hole here up the top. So the snap ring had actually worked its way loose and been worked up the side of the piston, between the piston and the cylinder, until it came into the combustion chamber. By then it had broken up and a piece of it got stuck in the crown of the piston. So this was a 3-cylinder motorcycle, so 3 cylinders and pistons later the motor was running again. It was actually running when I took it apart. I was lucky it didn't seize while I was driving down the road. And another thing on snap rings, a flat style snap ring is made by cutting it with a die, and one side of it is usually flat where the edges are relatively sharp, like this edge is sharp, and if I turn it over, I can see the edges are rounded. So I usually try to put the sharp edge on the side facing out from any pressure. So the pressure on this will be from the wrist pin trying to push out, so I'm going to put the flat side facing out. Now my snap ring pliers, I haven't used these on this snap ring before. May not be squeezing it well enough, and they aren't. So I'm going to have to make a modification to my snap ring pliers. I'll be right back. So what I just simply did was I took my disc sander and removed a little material from the jaws so that the pliers would go a little closer together. Now in some cases instructions are provided to tell you if the opening in the snap ring should be up, down, or sideways. I don't have any instructions to that effect. And I'll just see now if I actually have removed enough material from my pliers. I did check to make sure the pliers fit the snap ring, but of course in a live demonstration they're reluctant to get along here. No, I haven't got quite enough squeeze there. And I don't want to over squeeze the ring, so I'll just take a little more material off the pliers. So I've removed a little more material from my pliers, and we'll see if this will work this time. Curved side in, flat side out. Hold the snap ring in place. And there, it has gone into the hole. I'll have to make sure it is in its groove. It does appear to be in its groove. I'll just shine a little better light on it here. So I'm going to push the wrist pin in just a little further. Actually, it's in a little too far. But I'm going to make sure the snap ring is in its groove, top and bottom. Isn't the best flashlight to use for this. Okay, the snap ring is in its groove. So now I will push the wrist pin out against that snap ring. Then, in behind where you can see, on the other side, I will install the other snap ring that's still here in the bag. I want the flat side out, and I'll just do this the same way I did this one here. Put on the pliers, opening down, try not to lose it. And make sure it is in its groove. And it sure feels like it. And it does look like it as well. Okay, now I'm ready to put some sealer on our gasket. And what I'm going to do is remove the blocks, rotate the crankshaft until the piston is down in the cases, and just carefully rest it there. And the gasket is not completely symmetrical. The gasket has cutouts for the transfer ports, so it must go on this way. The transfer ports are on the side. So I'm going to put some sealer on this. If I had a plastic bag, that would be perfect for this. Right there. Just use that plastic bag. And this is the cylinder base gasket. Sorry for the rustling. This is the cylinder base gasket that comes with the engine gasket set. Make sure I have the wrench handy for those nuts. There are other wrenches I can move them out of the way. And I have destroyed that gasket. Luckily for me, oh, did I spoke too soon? I should have another base gasket here in another set. Well, not in that set. I have another base gasket here. I have several sets. So there's a lesson to be learned from this. Be careful handling your gaskets. So there we have another cylinder base gasket. That one is no good. The split in it will provide a place for leaks, which is what we're trying to avoid. So now I will carefully apply sealer to this. I'll probably have another one, but my goal isn't to go through all the gaskets I have. Just put some sealer on here. Just spread it around with my fingers here. There's some on there. Cap on this straight one. Make sure I put it on the entire surface as evenly as I can. Get it all over as many fingers as I can at the same time. Again, we just want a light coating of the sealer. If it oozes out, it's not doing any good. Sealer, you can see, in my opinion, is sealer that's not doing any good. So I'll take the sealer off my fingers so I don't end up with it all over everything. That's a little thin right there. Alrighty. So we want that side down. We don't want to get it all over the piston. The gasket on, and it looks like the gasket, there's a thick side and a thin side. Thin side, thick side. So that gasket is definitely made correctly. Carefully put it on over the studs here. Till it's down on the case. Okay, now there is a little bit of sealer on the top. I'll just smear it out so none of it's over thick. Be careful not to pull the gasket apart. Now we want to check our pin locations on the piston. I can see them here. It's hard to see from where you are on the camera. The bottom pin is right there. So that's, from looking from the front, it's about 1 o'clock. And I think the other pin is opposite it. So the two pins are opposite, so the ring gaps end up opposite, which is ideal. You want the ring gaps opposite, so if they're lined up, it's possible that they could leak gases past them. So let's cover off our cylinder here. And I'm going to lift this back up. Carefully set our blocks of wood in here. going to put some oil on the piston. A little more. Towel here. And the next bit gets interesting here. Just going to oil the piston and the rings. I don't want to get oil all over the gasket, so that's why I've got the cloth on it here. Oil on the top of the piston is not going to do us a lot of good, so and we'll make sure the rings are in the correct rough positions. Some of these tools out of the way here. And this is the cylinder we cleaned and lightly oiled. I'm going to put some more oil here. Now it's important when installing the cylinder over the piston that the cylinder isn't rotated as you put it down over the piston.